Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
This is CNN.
CNN Sports Tonight is Charlie Barkley, and you can debit his account another several grand as he's ticketed for beefing the refs Monday. We'll have the totals and highlights. Plenty of action on the court as the Hornets venture into the ouch house. Can Steve Smith and the Heat cool out the suddenly sizzling Sixers? In college hoops, Michigan gets all at once in Minnesota and then some. In hockey, they take it to the wall in Montreal. Some eye-popping goaltending as the Habs host New Jersey. And it's the People's Court in Canada, the case of Lindros versus the Beard Lady.
Beard lady.
Well, we'll get to that.
We'll find out.
We shall
Hello
explain.
again, everybody. I'm Nick Charles.
And I'm Fred Hickman, and we've got lots to talk about tonight, including Charles Barkley and his fiscal fitness.
Yeah, he's going to need a calculator soon. Charles Barkley had a very expensive lesson again.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, time to fire up those old Gerald cable boxes. Here we go. My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. And we're going back to the 80s and early 1990s, when if you were watching cable sports, part of your regimen, your daily regimen, was to either go point your button-pushing cable box to either ESPN and SportsCenter. You were the team SportsCenter, or you were team Nick and Hick on CNN Sports Tonight. Fred Hickman and Nick Charles, the dynamic duo there. And to be honest, it was the best of times, frankly, because you had the best of sports journalism really to choose from every night and multiple times a night, where these two wrap-up programs and shows of record that were really the place to really find out what the heck happened or was happening in sports that evening, even late evening, as a wrap-up to what was going on. So it was really kind of like your ultimate companion to what was going on in sports at the time. And CNN Sports Tonight arguably helped craft what SportsCenter ultimately became, itself kind of a juggernaut. But make no mistake, CNN Sports Tonight was a de facto choice for the intelligentsia out there, for the cognoscenti out there, with Messrs. Fred Hickman, the conversation's topic this week, and Nick Charles, the two of them together, quite the pair. And Harrison Golden is here this week. He is our guest, and he is I guess you could call him now the co-author of this wonderful new book that really is the biography of Fred Hickman, and frankly, an autobiography that was begun in the latter months of Fred's life, untimely passing away a few years ago. Harrison Golden, a colleague of Fred's in his later career at the local television level, was just moved enough to pick up where Fred left off and complete the task. And it's a wonderful book. It's a great read. It's called Channeling: My Life on Air, Off Air, and in Living Color, as told by Fred Hickman and finished in that voice by our guest this week, Harrison Golden. It is available wherever good books are found. It is published by Scorecard Press. And of course, we'll have a couple of links to the book here in the show description or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, where you'll find a couple of convenience links to our friends at Amazon, where we'll get a couple of shekels of referral of when you purchase the book in that general way. But this is a wonderful tale of a very influential, perhaps not obvious to a lot of folks. Fred Hickman was very inspirational to a lot of folks coming up in the business, especially if they were African-American hopeful sportscasters. Certainly Stuart Scott has gotten his props for being that in the 1990s, but I'm not so arguably Fred Hickman, I think perhaps was maybe the inspiration or an inspiration to Stuart Scott, having started his career earlier than Stuart did. And I don't think people will argue that fact. Matter of fact, if you check out the wonderful podcast series on ESPN Unlimited, Rich Eisen has a great series. The first season is now complete of this was SportsCenter. You will hear multiple comments to the effect of Fred Hickman's inspiration to multiple folks, including Stuart Scott, as well as a fear amongst SportsCenter back in the day of competing. Well, not fear of competing. It was a ratings competition, right? There are a lot of people at SportsCenter who were looking over their shoulder at CNN Sports Tonight and vice versa. It was a very competitive time where the best was being seen by both of them as they fought it out for the nightly rankings and ratings of sports highlights and commentary. And that's kind of where we find ourselves this week with our conversation with Harrison Golden. And you will learn a lot. You will learn that Fred Hickman and Nick Charles were not this off-the-cuff pairing. They actually knew each other in local television in Springfield, Illinois, of all places, before getting to CNN in its very earliest days. We'll find out how that occurred. We'll find out that Fred Hickman indeed wound up going to SportsCenter later in his career. We'll learn the unfortunate sidebar of Fred Hickman's return to local television in Detroit and the drug habit that accompanied him, and his renaissance after getting clean, coming back to CNN for another and far longer run with his old pal, Nick Charles. There's the play of the day. You remember that? That was a feature of CNN Sports Tonight. CNN SI, you remember that sort of adventure where they tried to create a 24/7 sports channel, very similar to ESPN News. And, of course, the infamous Shaquille O'Neal vote that, let's say, Fred Hickman kind of screwed up by being the only person to vote not for Shaq in his first ever MVP opportunity. It was essentially a unanimous vote for the exception of Fred Hickman, a story that he never kind of was able to be, he could never relinquish, and was constantly the ire of Shaq. We'll get into that story too, and much, much more as we talk about the life and times of the late Fred Hickman, unsung, I think, hero and inspiration to many a broadcaster today. And here's our conversation with Harrison Golden we had just a few weeks back. Please, as always, enjoy. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, essentially in the voice of Fred. How about a little, though, for our audience, a little background on you and how you came to meet and befriend the dearly departed Fred Hickman, and the book story too, because essentially it seems like you picked up some pieces that were already in motion.
Yeah, so just to start, I am from upstate New York, Yankees country. Both my parents are from the Bronx. So growing up, we had the Yankees on constantly. I had the Yankees on constantly when I was growing up. And back in time, I guess we're talking 25 years ago now, 24 years ago, the Yankees decided to switch and create their own cable channel called the Yankees Entertainment and Sports Network, also known as YES. And that was my first glimpse of Fred Hickman. And I would watch the Yankees games, and they would have the pre and post game shows and occasional cut-ins to talk about highlights elsewhere in the world of baseball and sports. And Fred Hickman was the face and voice of that. He was the first voice of the YES Network when they launched in 2002. And the first time that I saw and heard him was through that. So there was that hometown connection. This was a guy who, face and voice of my team, talking about my team. I almost felt like I knew him just from that alone. So fast forward about 15 years after that, 2017, I get a job in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And all of my years of loving broadcasting, wanting to become a broadcaster and a journalist and a TV news person, I find myself at the NBC affiliate in Baton Rouge,
So
And lo and behold,
you're in the biz, right? You're in the TV news business then at this point?
yes, I'm in the TV news business at this point, 2017, and I had my interview. It was my interview at the station in March of 2017, March 17th of 2017. I had my job interview there in Baton Rouge with the news director and the staff, kind of do a tour through. And the moment I see him, I'm like, wow, okay. I didn't realize he worked with fantastic. And it just was this full circle experience that I'm traveling 1,200 miles to apply for a job that I eventually got, and here's this face that I remember when I was a child watching these Yankees games. And just right off the bat, we bonded. It was almost a second job interview, although it wasn't a job interview at all, really. It was just him talking about me, or and me talking about my life, and him asking questions about me and our love of bagels with schmear, and we bonded over that. And it was a face and voice of home so far away. So that was the first opportunity that I had with Fred to work with him for a few years over there. Now we talk about the book, and this is about 5 years later. So we keep in touch occasionally. He had taken another job elsewhere, but we still kept in touch occasionally. And I leave Louisiana for a job opportunity in North Carolina. And as I am driving, leaving Louisiana for uh, the foreseeable future at that point, I begin my journey. And as I cross and leave the Louisiana state line, almost to the second, because Fred knows his timing, he calls. And I don't even know if he knew that I was actively leaving at that time, but he just wanted to catch up and see how things were going. And I tell him, I said, "Hey, yeah, I just took this job in North Carolina. And I'm on my way. I'm actually driving there. I've got a whole bunch of boxes in my rear uh, seats." And we talk and we shoot the breeze and we reminisce about our time in Louisiana together and lessons learned, stories covered. And that pretty long drive from Louisiana to North Carolina, but he took me deep to Georgia, which is ironic given Fred's own history in the state of Georgia with CNN. And we didn't even talk about the book at that point. This was just in the weeks beforehand. He hadn't told me what he'd started to work on, and he had certainly hadn't told me about his diagnosis, which he had gotten a few months before his call. But in retrospect, like I love and cherish that conversation we had, him guiding me to my next journeys. But even in retrospect now, it feels so much more meaningful knowing what he was going through, knowing what he was fighting. And he eventually told me, filled me in on his illness and his hope in putting a book together and releasing it for the world to see and learn from and pick up on. And it was just, a real reminder that when you feel like uh, people out there, you experience life and you wonder, hey, I wonder how this person's doing. I don't know if they think much about me or what. You leave an impact. And Fred certainly left an impact beforehand, but certainly in that call. And that friendship continued for up until his passing later that year. And it was, talk about a rally. Fred and I rallied together and worked on this, and thankfully enough, we have this story of his historic and legendary life put to print.
And it's really great, especially if you grew up like I did around this time when cable television was emerging from its infancy into, I don't know, its adolescent stage, crawling, walking, running into walls, all that kind of stuff, and that comes through in the timeline of his career. At what point? Upon Fred's passing, like from a book writing and production process, right? This is more of a process question, and we'll get into the meat of his
Sure.
life and his heritage. Uh, at what stage did you, shall we say, inherit or was the manuscript, if you will? Like, how much did you have to do in the wake of his passing versus how much had been done sort of ahead of time? And frankly, how accurate was the stuff that he had been telling you about, like all his stops and things?
Yeah, I think thankfully we were at the point where what he had said was what he wanted to say. It's not a particularly long book, and I think that's by design. Fred wanted something that people can flip through and enjoy, not necessarily interrupt their lives to learn about his life, but companion. And I love that word. You talk about sports books. Roger Angel, of course, one of my favorite sports writers. Companion. I think of that word and the role that referring to books as companions can play. And I think certainly that's what Fred's book feels like. And so as far as the accessibility of it, that's really important. So a lot of it was done already, which thankfully was the case. It's still, it was tough. I mean, it took a while for me to really look through and um, give it another read. It felt unfair. It felt like he should be here. He should be telling the story, and I will full-heartedly say, as glad as I am to be on this podcast and talk about Fred's life, it does still feel a little unfair, and he should be here. It's unfair that he's not here to talk about that in his terms. So the best we have are the stories he told, and I think in some ways that we could say that about a lot of historic lives.
And I
Uh,
think,
yeah.
frankly, when one reads a book, this feels, and I think you shouldn't be so harsh because on yourself because this comes across as his voice, right? So I don't, in many respects, you like the title implies, you are literally and figuratively channeling his words. So
Mhm.
in my mind, it comes across very accurately and authentically. So I wouldn't,
Well, thank you.
I wouldn't cast much aspersion to what
Yeah.
you've been able and it's great that you actually followed through to do so because again, so I think most people know the person, the persona of Fred Hickman from his legendary, I would say, 20 years or so in the CNN Turner sports world, right? And I think most people maybe know or maybe don't know that he was one of the most instrumental figures in the emergence of that network, especially in the realm of sports, which was not its primary function, but it was just a component of the newscast process, right? We'll get into that in a second,
Mhm.
but um, there's no denying that most people know Fred Hickman aside his longtime colleague Nick Charles, and the two of them were, how can I best describe it? SportsCenter before SportsCenter, even though that's not really true.
Yeah.
SportsCenter started like 9+ months earlier than that, but
Right.
they were
79. Yeah.
they were essentially the sports, rundown a couple of times a day in a news wheel for this thing called Cable News Network. And I think most people still remember him for all of that work and stuff. How much did you know about his CNN days and all the other stuff before he told you that, or before you met him?
I mean, I've always been a student of broadcasting history, sports broadcasting history. So I knew a little bit. I knew that he had had a show on CNN. I knew that he had been on for many years before. I mean, before I'd gotten to him in 2017. I mean, he had his most of his career behind him at that point. So I had a general sense, but I mean, just I think about that conversation. Okay, referring back to his time in Springfield, Illinois, talking to Satchel Paige and Cool Papa Bell and that impetus to go to Atlanta, get that job at CNN. It was just the history that behind that conversation, not just the people involved there in the sports world. Satchel Paige and Cool Papa Bell, two fantastic, incredible pitchers of their time, and Fred Hickman, whose history was in the making. You think about that a lot, and it took him a long time to realize the impact that he had, not just on broadcasters, but people of color in the broadcasting business. And thankfully enough, he had a few times in his own career in life where people flatly told him, I never saw anybody who looked like you on TV before. If there were a lot of local TV markets in the 1970s that would not hire black sportscasters, newscasters. So you have cable all of a sudden. Ooh, Ted Turner, all of a sudden, with CNN getting the news out there and filling in so many of those information gaps in America. Given viewership was not what it later became, because not as many people had cable back then, but it was a start. And all of a sudden, you had these people watching faces that reflected who they were, who they identified with. And it was just, I cannot speak from personal experience for black broadcasters or black aspiring broadcasters, but to me, it's very difficult to put into words that magnetism, that very specific magnetism that Fred offered in that time. And working on this book was important for that.
Yeah, I think Stuart Scott has gotten a lot of accolades from his time in the 90s at SportsCenter and stuff.
Rightfully,
I think,
yeah.
But no, rightly for sure. But I think that this is why I think the story of Fred is really interesting and important in the, shall we call it, the evolution of sports broadcasting in the latter part of the last century, right? Because you're talking about identity and the lack of opportunities. I mean, the two of you, I'm going to say, frankly, as we talk about this, talk about his, look for a first job. I mean, he's getting out of a small liberal arts college in the middle of Iowa, and he's looking around.
Yep.
There's a news director who flatly says to him in Iowa that, hey, the market's not ready for an African-American anything, frankly, on the air. And, that's a story that stuck with him, and it reveals itself later on in the book. And that, it's interesting because the way you read the narrative, it's almost like, he understands the dynamics at play. Certainly, of course, not happy about it, nor discouraged from trying to overcome it. But you're right. And the advent of cable essentially accelerates a ton of stuff and opportunities that, without it, right, would have been a more difficult journey trying to find the quote unquote right market to break through.
Yeah. And I mean, people talk about cable now, and it's almost easy to forget how granular the cable business was back then. And this channel that people didn't think would last more than 3 or 4 months became what it became. And it offered so many people an opportunity to break through in a way that I'll say it, they wouldn't have been able to otherwise, because of policies, newsroom policies, political policies in place.
Tell me about WICS in Springfield, because this is in Illinois. This is it's ironic. We're recording this the very day that, and you recount Fred's soul searching as he was considering moving out of Springfield to go to take this new job at this fledgling thing called CNN. The very first game of the Women's Professional Baseball League is starting in that very same stadium today in Springfield. Because we love new leagues, challenger leagues, and that kind of stuff. Ironic. But explain this station to me, because this was his first job, really legit the job. I mean, that wasn't a part-time thing or radio or on the side in television. Springfield, Illinois, not the largest market in the world by any means, is essentially his hometown market, if you will. But I learned in this book, it's interesting. It almost was a little bit of a tributary to some of the early talent pool at CNN. I didn't know this. Maybe you can describe some of that and frankly how he got from market number, I don't know, 100 plus to a national broadcast thing, even though it was a fledgling cable thing. Because that's today people look at that and go, that's impossible.
Yeah, it's like the not ready for primetime players. If you talk about it like that. Although I guess they were ready for primetime after all. Nick Charles, who I want to get back to the story a little bit of how Fred and Nick met. It was at WICS. It wasn't even with Fred working at WICS. It was with Fred, a high school student, making funny faces into the camera like, I don't know, any knucklehead in high school would. And Nick is the guy with the camera and the microphone doing his stand-ups on the hardwood floor after a high school game. And Fred's in the bleachers just, nah, 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 look at me. And it's just this surreal moment where little did we know down the road, not only would Fred wind up working at WICS, the same station that Nick Charles was working with at the time, Flip Spiceland, another name, the Weather World, he was the meteorologist there. So the three of them, they all went. And obviously not a coincidence because we found out when Fred was trying to figure out what to do with his career, Flip Spiceland very casually, yeah, trying this thing out in Atlanta. We'll see how it goes. Worth a shot, right? And then Fred says, yeah, worth a shot. There we go.
And it's amazing because those early days at CNN were, you could see the clips and stuff, it was making things up. It was planned for sure. But and there's a great documentary on Ted Turner that's on HBO Max. You can watch and get some of the
I love it. It was great.
Yeah. The visuals of what was going on and the carpentry and all that kind of stuff. But it's fascinating to sort of see how the powers that be at least had the notion to have a half hour repeated or a couple of half hours each day devoted specifically and exclusively to sports as almost like the sports section, if you will, of the day's newscasts. And to me, it's really intriguing because having become a cable junkie in the late 70s, early 1980s, to see Fred Hickman and Nick Charles, the chemistry, and it's interesting to hear sort of the description of how it sort of came together because I'm not sure it was sort of preordained, but how do you, based on his words and your recollections of what he said, I mean, how do you describe that coming together and that chemistry? Was it just pure luck or something else?
Oh man, it's tough to explain. And certainly I did not have the privilege of having that access to it at the time. And by the way, for reference here, as I'm talking to you, I'm looking at an old magazine advertisement that I've hung up on my wall. To catch what happened in sports today, watch Nick and Fred tonight. And it's the two of them just with their fingers pointed at the other, big smiling to the camera lens. It was just this magic. And certainly both were talented, and it's not that. It's just something that went beyond, something that had this life greater than its own. And certainly they both had to be who they were in order for this to work. But at the same time, there had to have been a larger force at play. They both did their rehearsals. They could bounce off each other, right? Not just in terms of writing, but in terms of tone and in terms of the questions they would ask the people they would interview. The best we could do is try to emulate it, but at the same time, you just have to appreciate on its own what they had and also what they had for such a long time. Because I mean, in terms of years now, 1980, Fred leaves in around 84, goes to Detroit. We'll talk about that later. Comes back 86. So and then 96 they or 97 they split up for this CNNSI project. So that's like 13, 14 years. That is as Fred would lovingly put it, uh, more time than Lucy and Desi. And I guess in some ways they were the Lucy and Desi of 11 p.m. sports rundown shows in the 1980s and early 90s.
Well, we always put this in perspective too, and you and he together kind of express this sort of in the book, right? Where it's, yeah, you have to remember too the time, right? So 1979 was the official launch of ESPN to audiences, an audience of what, dozens, hundreds, right? This is before MTV. This is before basically most of the cable infrastructure had, was building out in the latter part of the 80s. This is kind of an oasis, right? So for people who are getting this newfangled thing in their homes and their Gerald boxes with the clunky push buttons that get you maybe all of 36 channels, right? There's a sort of oasis if you're a sports fan. Certainly, you discovered ESPN. Maybe you saw the SportsCenter thing, but you knew that 11 o'clock Eastern. I guess it was also 7:30 Eastern. I think it was 7:30, and there was a 2:30.
It changed, yeah.
Changed. It moved around, but there were two or
Right.
three places during the course of the day where you literally had this specific, straightforward, right? Not jokey, not, it was literally like packed full of national sports news, like it was its own news program. And that right there was its own thing and was, for a news audience, it's like, wow, that's like, I don't need to change a channel. I don't need to figure out the ESPN thing because they're running a game, that kind of thing. Um, there is at least humility in the narrative here that some of this could be the connection that the two of them, because they were great on camera and they work very well together. But some of it also too is just frankly audiences building because there is a rarity out there, which is a regularly scheduled, professionally done, highlight clip filled recap of what's going on or what has happened today in sports. And there's really very little of that out there. And I got to tune in and watch that.
Yeah, and it's nice and it's a novelty to have a cable box and wow, I have all of these channels. But that novelty wears off after a little bit and you need substance. And I think that's what it was. And they were able to put that together in a way that held the test of time. Just that chemistry, that ability to almost, I hesitate to use the word spite because I don't think it was that malicious, but there was an audience out there that said, yeah, this isn't going to work. And these people in the CNN sports department, not just the show, but an entire CNN sports department, every day they would come in and try to prove these people wrong. That, yeah, we can put a half hour together and get all of these highlights and stories and interviews together. And I think that is what carried them through that finish line for such a long time. And again, ESPN SportsCenter did not have that audience in the beginning. It was really CNN incorporating that news mindset that the average viewer at that time had watching CNN and said, hey, you just watched 23 and a half hours of all this other stuff. How about this little palate cleanser, I guess?
It also treats sports seriously, right? As journalistic,
of course,
worthy of coverage and stuff. And I think the audience appreciated that, especially in the early years when. I mean, it's interesting too because you and I have talked about offline this relatively new podcast that is out there on the ESPN platforms called "This Is SportsCenter," which is sort of Rich Eisen's look back, and he was a 1990s guy, right? So it was, there's obviously more look back there, but in those earlier years, right, there wasn't even this competition as much as it was sort of this I don't know, trying to get legitimacy for sports generally, as well as sports reportage specifically, like CNN was doing. And I think it was, I want to call it refreshing, but it was nice. It was amazing to see how sports could be treated in a serious manner when, on the local television front, which is really the only other options you had on television, maybe national too, it had a little bit of a jokey kind of thing to it, right? It was kind of, it was the couple of minutes at the end of the broadcast, and it wasn't as serious and as straightforward as these guys were doing it, but they did it in such a congenial style that also made it an attractive thing. So it was kind of like a 1-2 punch in many respects. There's this rocket ship that was sort of just getting out of orbit, right? And these two guys who kind of did it well and did it in a style that was just straightforward and quality.
Right, straightforward and quality, but we talked at the same time as you knew that they had good chemistry and that they found a way to navigate that. And that's so hard. I know from experience that is such a difficult task to almost subliminally be able to cover the news and have that teamwork, but also reassure people and say, hey, we're these two guys, we have a show, but we're also, we're simpatico. We get it. And you exactly said it right there, that it created this chemistry, not just between Nick and Fred, but the chemistry with the viewers. And it comes down to I think the best impression and the largest compliment that Fred got or could have gotten working for many of those years on Sports Tonight with Nick is, we just feel like you're a show we could turn on in the bar and watch the news, but at the same time, we could watch you in the living room too with your family. So having this balancing act was really something special. And I think they took Reese Schoenfeld's attempts of getting a show that everybody in the bar would watch and took it tenfold. Masterful.
So explain to me, and I was not really too aware of the entirety of the story, but those first 3 or 4 years, those guys not only established the chemistry and stuff, but they became regular routine watching, especially as more and more sports junkies were getting cable. What happens in '84? He sees the local television realm, and I'm assuming that. Let me rephrase this. My assumption is that when you're coming up in the industry around this time in the early '80s, right? This cable thing is still kind of squishy and certainly has opportunities if you have more of an entrepreneurial mindset and you can maybe take some chances and stuff. But the reality is that if you're an upcoming broadcaster or newscaster or certainly sports guy, and that they tended to be more guys than gals, let's be honest, but is somebody interested in doing sports reporting? The tried and true path had been established where you had to work at small television station markets and proverbially work your way up into either a big market, which was still paying fairly big dollars in the New York, LA, Chicago markets, et cetera, where you could you could live like a king in your local market, or crack that code and get into the quote unquote bigs and national, right? And cable was this sort of, now, I wouldn't call it side street, but another way to get to the national front. But it wasn't like broadcast network, right? So I got to think in the early '80s, people like Fred Hickman, people like Nick Charles, the Keith Olbermans of the world, right? People who are kind of, straddling this line. They're still being dazzled by some big paychecks in some major markets to do the local thing again. Is that what was going through his head at that time? Or was he just not enjoying his CNN thing at the time? Like, why did he leave to go to Detroit? Because in retrospect, that looks like a step down. I'm going back, quote unquote, to local. But that really wasn't the case the way I just described it, right? Because local was still the thing.
Yeah, it was still the thing. And, we just talked about the formats, right? Cable news was still trying to figure out its modus operandi, its wheel, if you will. There was still a lot of experimentation going on in the cable business, certainly in the cable news business, of which CNN was, just CNN. You didn't have MSNBC. You didn't have Fox News. You didn't have, you had, I think, Satellite News Channel, that's
Which
separate,
lasted
but
all of about 6 months, I
right.
think. But we
Yeah,
digress.
CNN was its own thing. And so there was a little uncertainty there still, financially, format-wise, you name it. But also, beyond any sort of formatting discussion, it was about forming those bonds. And I've had conversations too at the network level with people who sort of envy the local folks and the impact, the connection that local broadcasters have with their local viewers. Certainly, for a beat job like sports, you don't necessarily always want to parachute down, ask a few questions, and parachute back up. You want to form bonds with the people you interview. You want to form bonds with the viewers you have in various cities. So I think Fred just wanted more of that. He had gotten a taste of it in Springfield, of course, at ICS, but he wanted just to see what else he could do, who else he could not just meet, but connect with. And I think that's always what it was about with him. So this was just another facet for him to do that.
Well, it also had to probably be a bigger paycheck too, right?
Hey, money
I
talks.
almost said Chicken News Network, Chicken Noodle Network,
Watch it.
which was the derisive, right? And
Yeah.
fair disclosure, I interned at CBS News in Washington in the mid '80s, and then I came back in the early '90s to work there in the Washington bureau, and it was still regarded as sort of derisive kind of thing. Of course, the first Gulf War, changed all of that, and people, really gave CNN its kudos from there on after, frankly, and it was the beginning of the end of broadcast news, but another issue. But my point is,
Which we
right,
touch on a little.
yeah. But my point is that it's still hard to turn down a probably very lucrative offer from a big market like Detroit, and I'm sure that had to enter into its calculus. But describe to me the story of Detroit with him, because I could not derive from the book, and maybe you chose or he chose not to get too specific about how or why or not, but was this just an exacerbation of something that was already beginning in terms of his either drug use or whatever, experimentation or whatever, or was this something that kind of happened as he got to Detroit and it was new at that point, and then I don't know. I'm just curious as to the origin story of it, right? Because some would say, well, it seems convenient, like, oh, Detroit was the issue, but was it?
Detroit was the setting. I don't think it was the issue necessarily, although, just that is where it happened. And I think, at CNN, he didn't have that issue. And then he moves to Detroit, and again, it's not the city itself, but it's, the people that he had surrounded himself with at that time. And I do think there was a bit of a void, or just a confusion. In some ways, Fred's story is the story of cable. And there was a lot of uncertainty back then in the cable business. And there was a lot of uncertainty within Fred about Fred. He wanted to just see what he could do and almost chase this ambition of his. And I think it came up to bite him in some ways in those efforts in Detroit, almost the day he had moved in. So would it have happened had he not run into the same crowd in his Detroit apartment building? I can't say that, but all I can speak to is the confusion and also, how young is he? He's born 1956. At this point, he's still in his 20s. He still had a lot to figure out, and this was the manifestation of that.
Yeah, and look, and that's why I'm bringing up sort of the reality check of what a career in this business was at that time, because it may not, frankly, even be a distinction between the shakiness of the early days of cable versus broadcast and the perceived stability. It's still this hustle, right? And frankly, it's still a hustle
Mhm.
today. It's just done differently. But you
And
know,
it was the 80s also, just
well, the go-go 80s, and
the
sure, the
80s had
availability.
issues.
Fair enough, fair enough, and that's absolutely an important part of the tableau. But I guess the point is that you're still, when you talk about uncertainty and one's career and soul searching and what do I want to do and where can I find stability in myself and what am I on this earth to do and in my short time here, that kind of stuff, right? I mean, the news business, the television station business. I mean, it's crazy. It's always been that way. There's not a lot of certainty. There's always a lot of job shifting. You're in one day, you're out another. Ratings, all these other pressures and stuff. And look, this is a guy, right? Just like everybody else at the time, is looking for the best situation, the best sort of paycheck, and the ability to do what she or he want to do in this crazy business with a revolving door and chairs of news directors and general managers and all that kind of stuff, right? So some of this is to your question, right? And I'm maybe going to fill it in, even though you co-wrote the biography. It could have happened in another market. It could have happened in another job, right? It's just that dynamic, right? In the 1980s, right? I don't think it was Detroit's fault. I don't think it was the apartment building's
No,
fault
no.
per se.
Great city.
Yeah, all these people are chasing dreams, and part of that dream in this business is short hop here, another hop there, get my tape seen over there. And frankly, it's not always based on skill and talent. A lot of it is luck and other things that creep in from the world of quote unquote show
Mm.
business.
Yeah, I think too, I say it was Detroit and a fantastic city. Let's also keep in mind this was 1984 in the home of the Detroit Tigers. City at a time that, frankly, as a Detroit Tigers fan, you had a lot of rough years after that. But 1984 was a great year for that team. And it was a year that had a lot of national eyes on it, a lot of national attention. And uh, here's Fred now at the local level. I don't want to think too much into his head, but the dynamic there of a lot of these national people coming down and Fred wondering, did I make the right call? Did I make the right call coming down here versus going back up to the network level? I don't know if that was. It's all speculation, but I would be curious just how that dynamic came into play. At the same time, he had some wonderful opportunities there and met a lot of great players. So in some ways, even if he felt, even if he might have felt at one point like Detroit had been a dark spot in his life, I think it proved to him, albeit in retrospect, that he was able to converse and build connections with, at the time, a fantastic baseball team.
Describe to me it feels to me like he had two angels kind of on his side. One at the
Mm.
station, and one back on the ranch in Atlanta. Do you want to describe those two people who, at least implying that were kind of helped get him some chances that he needed?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, his news director at WDIV Channel 4 in Detroit was pivotal in saying, you need to get help. Uh, I'll be here for you. This is a station. We have our resources. We have our support systems in place. And he encouraged one of the people who encouraged Fred to get help. And so Fred did, and ultimately said, as we detail in the book, that it's just too many issues in his current setting, and he wanted to move on back. But he wouldn't have been able to move back to Atlanta had it not been for Nick Charles. And that friendship, even just a mere few years in, that friendship that they had, Nick and Fred, had become so strong. And Nick fantastic judge of talent that he was still able to say, we have a gift here. We have something here that matters, not just to you, Fred, but to me, to the viewers, and he deserves another chance. That was what Nick Charles told his bosses at CNN, who, listen, we talked about the uncertainty of cable news in the mid 1980s and where it's going to go, what happens next. So they had a lot of a lot of issues that they needed to discuss. Bill McPhail, Ted Turner, all these names in the CNN brass. Was Fred worth the risk? There are a lot of questions that we need to ask about our placement in broadcasting. Can CNN even sustain itself? 1986, they were started to get at least some answers, but did they want to be weighed down by issues? It turns out giving Fred another chance wasn't weighing down at all. It was an opportunity that we saw for many years thereafter, more than a decade thereafter, Fred Hickman returning to CNN and not just recreating the chemistry and the dynamic between Nick and Fred at 11 o'clock each night, but going beyond it and seeing CNN grow, certainly in the late 1980s and boom, into the 90s and the Gulf War. They become faces of this giant of a network, an international giant of a network. And it was all because of Nick Charles, just simple, in a room saying to one person to another, let's give him a chance.
And now, the heralded portion of the show revered by pauper and pasha alike. From coast to coast and border to border, yes, it is the play of the day. And this one hails from the Meadowlands of New Jersey. That's where the Knicks were in town. And look at this end-to-end effort, Nick, by Shackelford. Charles Shackelford of the New Jersey team blocks a shot at one end, hustles down the floor, and gets the basket to go at the other end. You know, see, that's what you get when you work hard in practice. Comes up with the big block. Patrick Ewing, no less, gets on his horse, runs the floor well, and gets his just desserts at the end, and he gets to go home and see himself being the play of the day. It's great.
Play of the day, brought to you by Budweiser. Beechwood aids for that clean, crisp taste. This Bud's for you.
An interesting dynamic, right? The timing of it almost seems exquisite, his return, right? Because you're hinting also, too, that Turner, as an organization, is growing with lots of other, efforts and involvement in sports properties and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's the MGM purchase and all this stuff going on.
Sure, the colorization of those movies, which went over like a lead balloon. But the notion.
He apologized.
I know he did. The notion, though, of just truly how, and this comes back to what I was saying before about the growing importance of cable generally, of CNN particularly. Having these guys back together with their chemistry and then some almost just seemed just perfectly timed. And you have a great little anecdote in there about how perhaps he kind of recognized that he was back on a ship that was really getting into another orbit. Do you want to describe the play of the day banner that he saw on television during a momentous moment in world history?
Like it's a Zelig moment, right? Or a Forrest Gump moment. Berlin Wall is coming down. The Soviet Union is collapsing. And what is on the minds of people in West Germany? Let's take a bedsheet, take a Sharpie or spray paint. I guess it probably had to have been spray paint, and write play. Hey, Fred, here's our play of the day. I'm paraphrasing, but just saying, look at what's happening here. Look at what the world is experiencing right now. This opening of new avenues. And let's put Fred Hickman's name on that. Let's tell Fred, hey, put this on your show for the world to watch. Because of course, the world is watching CNN at this point in the late 1980s. Because they have their programming agreements in other countries, other continents. So it really just indicates how huge Sports Tonight is, not just in America at the time, because it was, but as a way to introduce the world to the stories of the sports and the games that we play. It's I get verklempt, as Fred would say.
What did the tell our audience what the banner said?
So let me
I'll tell
I
you.
have the book
Fine.
in front of me.
I'll tell you.
Fred to CNN play of the day. Something like that, right?
Yeah, it says Fred on CNN, United Germany, the play of the day. I mean, that
there we
takes
go.
Great ingenuity. And it encapsulates so much, right? Number one, of course, his career, he's back. Number two, CNN, wow, what a world force. Three, the sports thing and what they do goes beyond. It puts it all in perspective, because like a national broadcaster in the United States doesn't have nearly the reach and the influence, it seems, that CNN does. And then that's the things like Larry King come out of that, and Ted Turner is world peacemaker and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's an amazing sort of place to be in this stuff. All right, well, we've got a few remaining moments. I don't want to. There's so much more to this book, by the way. So the Fred Hickman story is not just CNN and Turner, although that's a big and memorable chunk of 20 years or so. But it's also important to remember at this time, the competition is really actually starting to happen. And you mention things like ratings, and people are starting to pay attention. And he wasn't really a guy who was sort of following all that stuff, but you can't not look askance to the ratings and stuff. And
You get the trade mags, yeah.
Yeah, but this is where the Rich Eisen podcast gets really interesting, right? Because around the 90s is when this SportsCenter franchise really started to congeal, and it was really kind of a dogfight. Really, it was these two regularly scheduled. I mean, this is the time when Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick, two former CNN sports employees, right, who are now doing their shtick, literally and figuratively, on SportsCenter and stuff, right, where these guys were still doing their chemistry-laden, straightforward approach, right? So it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The best of times, if you're a viewer, because you had options for high quality, must watch recap of day and interviews and all that kind of stuff. The bad news is they're no longer the only game in town, right? But I think in this case, the rising tide floats all boats, and giving Fred and others there at CNN other opportunities besides just manning the desk for a half hour.
Right. And, keep in mind, we had the big show, so to speak, Dan Patrick, Keith Olbermann in the 90s, but you had ESPN2 and ESPN News. And on the news front, it was very difficult, because you're taking competition from all angles, right? The mid-90s, 1996, you had, on the same day, if I'm not mistaken, MSNBC, as it was called then, and Fox News Channel launching. So you had CNN now struggling to find and maintain their audience there. So that also took a chunk out of Sports Tonight, because a lot of those news hounds, so to speak, weren't necessarily sticking around with CNN to wait for Sports Tonight at 11. And then, of course, you have ESPN News and Fox Sports News, which Keith Olbermann then goes over there. And then Keith Olbermann goes to MSNBC. So, it just becomes this mammoth of an industry. And by the way, a little thing called the internet. So it was tough. And, Nick and Fred, they part ways, both working at CNN SI, as it was called then, in 1996, because CNN, Sports Illustrated, all part of this gigantic Time Warner merger, AOL Time Warner merger, I believe, eventually. So it was just a lot of competition and a lot of room to grow. And they still see each other in the hallway. Their desks are still not too far away at this 24-hour experiment called CNN SI, which was an attempt to compete with the newsier side of sports, not necessarily to have sports events like a Fox Sports News would, or Fox Sports Net would, but maintain that news sports ethos. Nick Charles has a Nightline style show, Page One, and Nick continues to helm the desk, with now a rotation of co-anchors. Vince Cellini, one notable one, another fantastic talent. My goodness. Uh, but it was tough. It was tough, and again, it was this idea of where do we fit into all of this. So just left a lot of unanswered questions, and it did leave Fred wondering, okay, now what? Right, and he would fill in occasionally. I think he maybe even done some news-related shows on CNN, working that muscle. He filled in on Talkback Live. I don't know if you recall that show.
That was oh, come on. It was a Larry, did Larry King helm that for a little while and then it became his show, or is it
I think this was separate,
Sylvia's?
although Fred was also there a few times.
Yeah, okay.
Just try to branch out, just see, okay, like if the business is going to change, what else can I do? So I guess if we are to go, jump a little bit only to go back, it helped him realize, yeah, maybe I could talk about things other than sports too. Maybe I could facilitate conversations about worldly issues on Talkback Live, or I could even go to Times Square on Y2K and lead the coverage. I mean, we talk about CNN now on New Year's Eve, Anderson Cooper, Andy Cohen, and the fun they have. But on Y2K, Fred Hickman was the face, which I think to me is another uh, Forrest Gump or Zelig, or insert a character here moment, Walter Mitty moment, just where he just finds himself in the center of the universe once again.
All right, so there's so much more to this book, so I highly encourage our listeners, of course, to get it because there's much more of the career to come. Obviously, he helped start the Yes Network, as you mentioned earlier. A lot of other exploits thereafter. Some tragedies, of course, along the way, including the passing of his longtime on-air colleague Nick Charles. And there's so much more too. The revelations and the understanding of the influence, right? Other people of who are interested in sports broadcasting who are not white and male, right? Who look at
Sure.
as an icon, and become comfortable with the notion of chasing their own passions and stuff. So there's so much more and all that, and we haven't even scratched the surface of those stories. So, but I do before we run, I do have to check the box on this one, right? Because this is something I kind of really didn't remember or know about, which is probably to Fred's liking. But
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Go
yeah,
ahead.
it's an important part of the theme. Back, like it's clearly yeah. So tell me about Alvin. Tell me about the Allen Iverson situation because but it's funny though in the end and all comes out fine. But
Yeah. Yeah, so it was supposed to be an anonymous vote. When Fred and I
tell me,
began this
what year
conversation.
was this, and what we're talking about a voting for what All Star, right?
Thank you. Yes, yeah. So it was an MVP 2000 to 2000, or is it 1999 to 2000 season, which was for Shaquille O'Neal, undoubtedly a career season, a fantastic year for him. So there were 121 writers, basketball writers, of which Fred was considered one. Who are we going to pick for the MVP in the NBA season to end in 2000? Everybody, 120 of 121, pick Shaquille O'Neal for good reason. There is one voter who selects Allen Iverson as his primary choice. That one voter was, as the leak would have it, Fred Hickman. So there was a lot of tension there, and of course, Fred's first instinct was, yeah, it was supposed to be an anonymous vote. You mail in your ballot. The only name attached to it is the one in the return address when you physically go to the mailbox, send it off. So he finds out in the Los Angeles Times one morning from his agent that, all right, LA Times is reporting that not only has Shaquille O'Neal lost the opportunity to become the NBA's first unanimous MVP, but the one who dealt that blow was longtime CNN sports anchor Fred Hickman. So it becomes this conversation about, why did you pick this? How clueless can you be? Sort of the hot takes, the anger that you might see these days in cable news. You see some elements of that in there. Talk radio, certainly, where people are saying, what were you thinking? How clueless can you be? And Fred's just taking taking the heat, trying to handle it, trying to give as many interviews as he could to calm people down and get people to realize, hey, listen, I vote on MVPs based on what they contribute to their individual teams. And Allen Iverson, you take him out of the equation, the Philadelphia 76ers would be in a very different place than they were then. So that was his argument. Did that tamper things down? A little, but Shaquille O'Neal was frustrated, and over the years, he voiced his frustrations about that vote.
But I would have been the first unanimous MVP, 100%. And some guy from Atlanta. What was his name?
Hickman.
Yeah, Fred Dumb Hickman.
Wait, get off Fred Hickman.
I ain't getting off, no. 'Cause if I see Fred Hickman in the street, there's going to be some stop signs moving.
Hey, Fred, I got your back.
Better.
Fred's a good dude. He's a great dude. I miss
Messed
Fred.
up history, Fred.
All right, that was LSU's own Shaquille O'Neal calling out our very own Fred Hickman for his vote in the 2000 MVP race that kept Shaq from being that unanimous MVP. But here in the Go Nation, it's time to give Fred Hickman a space to respond to Shaq Diesel.
It's 2016, right?
I checked.
That was 2000. First off, thanks to my good friend Charles Barkley for getting my back. Shaq's right. I voted for Allen Iverson that season on a so-called anonymous ballot.
So you thought.
How it got public, I'm not certain. I know I didn't do it, and I think I have an idea, but that's not the point here, is it? For the record, I love you, Shaq. I'm pretty sure I was the first interview that you did when you were named Rookie of the Year with the Orlando Magic. I proudly display one of your shoes in my home. Speaking of home, by the way, that's what Baton Rouge is for me now. And we do know that you love LSU and Baton Rouge. So the next time you're in town, Big Aristotle, we'll break the bread, we'll make the peace. My treat. Cost is no object. You're a Hall of Famer. You're one of the all-time greats. But you shouldn't have come for me. I didn't send for you.
Long story short, we see in the back of the book reminder of what Shaquille O'Neal said on Inside the NBA after Fred's passing. We'll never see another guy like Fred again. And those words came from Shaquille O'Neal. So, again, we talked about the, happy ending, I guess, compared to what it could have been. But it was definitely a very challenging few years. Then again, if the conversation is unanimous or not, he still had a great season. Shaquille.
Yeah, no.
O'Neal.
Why did he
So
vote?
that's-
Why did he vote for Iverson in the first place? Because he had done an interview with him and stuff, right, prior or something, as he was a phenom on the rise.
Yeah, and his rubric was he votes for MVPs based on what they contribute to their individual teams. You had Shaquille O'Neal on the Los Angeles Lakers at the time, which was stacked, absolutely stacked with fantastic players. But if you were to take Allen Iverson from that equation in Philadelphia, the 76ers would have been in a very different place. So that was his rationale. Is it right? Is it wrong? That became its own conversation. But to Fred's point, that was what he was going by. Funny enough, Allen Iverson did win the MVP the following year. So Fred became Nostradamus, if you will, on that. Predicting.
So many other great little anecdotes in this, and it's really a great read, especially considering, like, if you grew up, like I said, watching cable television and getting your sports coverage and news there from there. You'll delight and you'll know better some of the stories in front of and behind the cameras in this thing. But one last question for you, Harrison, before we let you sort of promote unabashedly. What going into this project, both when Fred was alive and after his passing, was there a revelation or a story or something that you learned in this process, either by him telling you or you discovering, that either knocked you back or that you didn't know, or something that surprised you, something that maybe folks who may have seen Fred in his heyday may just not know about, and or maybe it wasn't even in the book. What did you learn about him that you thought you knew, but maybe you didn't?
I think it was the friendship with Nick. I think it was, like, I knew, we all have YouTube. We can type in Sports Tonight, CNN clips, and see the two of them talking and giving highlights and dialogue and banter. But just that gratitude that he had, he never forgot. Up until Nick's final day, Fred always knew and appreciated the opportunity that Nick had given him in a very difficult time. And I think it was just that understanding that coded so much of what they did for decades, from 1980 to 84 and then 86 onward. Fred never forgot who had brought him where he wanted to go. And that informed so much of his desire to bring people where they want to go. And I see so many people talking about Fred as that stepping stone, that he did what he did to allow me to be here and do what I love. And I just hope that people read this book and see that determination in him. And that's hopefully something that people can carry now that he's gone for almost 4 years. But I don't think that influence that he held changes one bit.
All right, many thanks to Harrison, and the book is terrific. Highly encourage it, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. It is called Channeling: My Life on Air, Off Air, and in Living Color. It is written by our guest this week, Harrison Golden, in conjunction with the late Fred Hickman, and is available wherever good books are found. It is published by Scorecard Press, and of course you can get it through the convenient links in the show description this week, or going to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and you're searching up this episode 459 with myself and Harrison. You will find some convenient links to the book, and you will be whisked away to our friends at Amazon, where you will get the book as quickly as humanly possible, and we, in return, will get a very few, but certainly necessary shekels of referral love for purchasing, either the hardcover, the paperback, or the Kindle versions in that general manner. We appreciate your doing so, at least considering that. You can follow Harrison on Blue Sky, on X, and on, I believe, also on Instagram at Harrison Golden, all one word. Harrison, Harrison, Golden, Golden, Harrison Golden, all one word. You can follow us on the various socials, of course, too. You'll find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find us on X at goodseatsstill, and you'll find us on Instagram and just about everywhere else, including YouTube, by the way, where we post all these episodes for your streaming enjoyment, at goodseatsstillavailable, all one word. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And, that's all we've got for you this week. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and tell your friends, and have them tell two friends, and so on and so on. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts and stuff, and we appreciate you getting the word out continuously as we continue to grow our little mighty army of listeners. Thanks very much. We'll see you next week. Oh, thanks to Jerry Payne, of course, for his audio excellence. Can't forget that. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.